Welcome, LaDonna.
Hi, Cheryl.
Thank you for giving us your time. Brave voices having empowered conversations.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. And I'm Cheryle Gail Grace from Brave Voices. We are dedicated to breaking the cycle of silence that perpetuates childhood sexual abuse by normalizing the conversation, which is what we're going to do right now with LaDonna. And I'm in Mountain View, California, and it's May 15th, 2022. And are you in San Jose?
I actually am in my office in Campbell, California.
All right. Awesome. Great.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to start, LaDonna, with a little bit about who you are, whatever you want to share with us about your experience of having been harmed as a child. I'm especially interested in how you found your voice, how you moved into advocacy, and what those years were like for you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So when I think back on my life, especially my early development of teenage life as well as young adulthood, there was a lot of big rumblings inside, having been sexually abused and really wanting to figure out and sort out my sexuality, and found myself attracted to somebody that was quite the opposite in my young life, where I came from a family very secretive, quiet, put things under the rug that nobody really wanted to talk about. Perhaps generations of shame is my suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
And I married into a family that was very vocal and spoke up a lot and was able often to express themselves. So I found that attractive, which is what led me to a few things. One, advocacy, but marriage first and advocacy. So when I think about introducing myself, I currently am a therapist, as well as an activist, as well as I also see myself as a teacher and speaker. I do all of those and enjoy most of those most of the time. I also see myself, and the important identities I carry would include a cisgender woman, identifies queer, lesbian.
Wait, let me just question. Did you say cisgender?
Cis. Mm-hmm.
Cis. Educate me. I don't know what cisgender means.
So think of born as the gender that I currently am still identified with, right? So born as a female in female body, as well still in female identity. And so, yeah, so that may be a newer term, but it's certainly
that is for me. So it's cis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Huh. So I identify as a cis.
Cisgender, yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So in my younger life, finding my voice, there was this interesting transition in my early teens, really wanting to be leader, wanting to be unstuck out of much of what I think my system and my body felt. So by finding my voice and actually becoming a leader, it was reinforced that my voice was actually worthy of listening to at times, or that because my words, I think for most people, felt kind and welcoming, that I was encouraged to step into leadership. So some of that, I think, really was a catalyst for finding my voice. I also, though, remember when my big family secret of sexual abuse was exposed, I actually lost my voice for a while. And so until then, I had a voice, but not telling the secrecy, covering up the shame. But as the family secret was exposed, I didn't have a voice for quite a while. And that's what I think the therapy I chose to explore in my life was really helpful to me in witnessing my therapist at the time actually feel, she often felt angry and showed me her anger and that it was actually okay to be angry. And in that journey with her as a young 20-something-year-old woman, I realized I actually had reasons to be angry in my life. And I felt like it was the very beginnings of an adventure in learning my voice and welcoming to my voice all of my experience. Tremendous sorrow, tremendous sadness, tremendous joy in some ways in my life, but also tremendous anger and resentment and hurts that needed to be spoken for and shared. I can pause there for a moment just to see if there's anything coming up or you wanting to share, and then how I maybe turn that into activism.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about my own life, and it's so much easier for me to express my anger. Oh, I went to a meditation group every week, and we got it out. Or I would go to my pump class and really work hard, or go for a bike ride. But to go face to face with my father to express my anger, or to this day, I've still never been face to face to my brother who harmed me, to tell him the ramifications of his actions. So, when I hear you say, did you do that? Were you able to go to the people that you were angry with and express your anger to them?
Yes, I have. And I think my own sense of bringing compassion to my own system, though I wouldn't have called it that 30 years ago, what I realized is if I was going to allow my anger, I needed to do it in a way that I wouldn't regret. Because I think the backlash of doing something, then causing harm, would actually end up harming me internally as well. So I invited, and after my brother-in-law actually was choosing to pay for my therapy, it was the first opportunity when he actually said he wasn't going to pay for it anymore, that it kicked up an opportunity for me to sit with what that felt like. And initially I knew I was angry, but I wasn't so sure what that would feel like in the presence of another human being that I was angry with. So the very first time that happened, which I felt was such a blessing he actually gave me, was to let and take me up on that offer to sit in front of me in my own therapy, while I was probably feeling the height of an ant. Like I really didn't have my voice, and I kind of regressed and got really small. And my therapist at the time, Marcia, really just helped me kind of stay with me and find what I wanted him to know, the struggle I was sitting with in the months before he was actually with me in my own therapy. So, and it hadn't been in therapy for very long, but I knew my anger was there, but it felt so far away, right? And I was really afraid of it.
And just for clarity, I just wanted to say that this brother-in-law was the person that harmed you.
He was one of them, but at the time it was the most important story and the biggest impact, because I had a relationship with him like a second father. He was 20 plus years older than me, right? So I had, of course, a deep relationship with him, almost as though he at times felt like a secondary father, right?
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time with their family. So my siblings family. So yes, I I believe, challenged some months later once again that maybe it was time to stop paying for my therapy. And I felt like I was just getting warmed up. Like I was just beginning to learn about myself and the burden and all the sorrow and the pain and the confusion, and also even my anger at myself for not having spoken up sooner, and all the places I carried my self-hatred and shame. So the second time he threatened to stop paying for my services, I actually asked him to come back. And what I had discovered in my own therapy with my therapist is I had a teenager and she was quite agitated. And that agitated teenager needed a voice. And she said it wasn't right, and the words she could find at the time was something to the effect of, wait a minute. This happened for years, off and on in my life. How dare you think 6 months in, even a year into my therapy, that I should be done by now, sorting all of this out, and threaten to stop taking responsibility for something that brought me to therapy to begin with, right?
Wow, far
So
out.
I didn't do it cussing at him. I didn't do it, but I had a voice, and it came with frustration and hurt and anger as a form of protection so that I could actually find a voice. And he was in many ways an angry person and a quite easily agitated person who yelled and was critical. And so he could handle it. It's kind of how I prepared my own system, right? And gave my own self permission, really, whether he could handle it or not. It felt like I was ready. And that to me was part of the healing and part of the growth in that process. Yeah.
Fantastic. That's just such a unique, I don't know if I've ever heard of the person who harmed paying for someone's therapy. I just think that's wonderful. And did you ask for that? Was that a request that you made?
I actually chose not to press charges because I also loved him, and I had deep care for the family and did not want to create more separation amongst their family, his family, my sister's family. And so I just made a request that he get help so that I felt maybe some certainty or reassurance that this wouldn't have happened to others. So in that, I think my sister advocated for my then services to be part of taking care of me and paying for what was deserved in my healing and in my journey. That's kind of how that came about. And he had the means, so that also with that privilege, he had the means to give me money, to support my journey in that way.
And do you feel that you feel pretty safe that he never did go on and harm anyone else?
Well, unfortunately, no, that's not true.
Okay.
I ended up and as you referred to earlier, I then did some activism and told my story out into the world in different ways. And unfortunately, in my telling of that story, and fortunately, unfortunate that they suffered or had an experience, but fortunately, my courage to tell my story also encouraged others to come forward. So there were others that actually shared and confided that there was incidences they also experienced. So there were several of us, unfortunately, that endured some challenge and pain and harm from those experiences. Yeah. Yeah. So that was a big burden also in telling the story. Honestly, at the time, I felt tremendously responsible, and I could barely hold all of my own pain, let alone now the pain of so many because I shared. So I know for many individuals in that journey of whether to tell or not, or whether to confront or not, or what do we do with this information? To me, it takes a lot of the inner work to prepare for often the backlash that comes at us when we choose to tell, and to discern my decision from the burden and belief of carrying others people's sorrow by choosing to tell was a really big growthful edge that also burdened a lot of pain. I carried a lot of pain and what felt like tremendous responsibility for kind of like opening Pandora's box, right?
I hear you taking on responsibility and saying what was created by your sharing, but what I imagine is all of these individual holding on alone, and
Sure.
you having your bravery to share. Now at least they know I'm not the only one. And right, to have that.
Yes. And for me, it's a yes and, because yes, you or I got to feel, wow, I'm not the only one. Therefore, the story I told about me being so responsible was a helpful shift in that belief, right? That there were others, which may have more to do with the fact that he was acting out than somehow I asked for it, or all the things we carry as beliefs around us as young people, right?
Mhm.
At the same time, there was a carrying of burden of responsibility, which I think is a generational female in particular in my own family of generations of feeling responsible for others. So with that belief and burden of feeling responsible for others, that's the part of me that felt bad.
Yeah.
Other people were now going to have to face something maybe they weren't quite ready to face, and stir up all the pain I was already living. And
Yeah.
certainly they were as well, but they might have had some protective systems that were not letting them get to it at that time in their lives, right? So the burden I felt is, oh my gosh, here I am telling, and ouch, what now sorrow and pain we're all feeling. And because it was my voice, you could see why my system took such young adult responsibility. I didn't have the knowing I have today about what that was, what that actually was deeply inviting, was healing to happen for all of them. But I couldn't make that happen.
No.
I was just imagining all the struggle, which I was still feeling at the time in my early 20s. Of course, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
And I'm just so curious, as far as, did you ever get feedback from the others as far as gratitude that there is this shared reality, and that there was some like you're saying, that the healing and the um no longer keeping it a secret? Was there eventually some connection through that with all of the others?
I'm not sure that a direct gratitude has been expressed. Um, I'm thinking about some of them aren't people I actually really ever had relationship with. So some I certainly did, and it allowed for some connection. Um, some felt maybe a bit of responsibility they didn't, me being younger than them, having said something sooner. I mean, it's far more complicated, right? Than
Oh, yeah.
woohoo, we're so glad we're together now. And
Right. I know. It's
we don't always feel that within the same system, because all of our stuff gets stirred, and we can find that amongst a community that has their own experiences of abuse. But just because there's a common experience around a larger extended group of people doesn't all mean that we're going to gather and kind of feel that that kind of kumbaya connection in the way we wonder or think could happen. One of the people, though, that I have felt much of my healing with is another of my own siblings that had their own experience of this, right? So in that way, there's been tremendous healing in our relationship, because we both do know what that experience was like within our family. And we did live it differently because we're several years apart, but we both lived something of similar nature within the same family structure. So in that way, we have a deep understanding of one another. Yeah. And a tremendous closeness because of that shared experience.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That it can be shared and move through the pain together.
Mhm.
It's amazing how just hearing all of these, how common it is, how prevalent, how.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have another experience with a friend's grandfather, and he's no longer alive. So I've done some of my own journeying around my relationship with him, and some of my own therapy that addressed that relationship. I never got to confront or address him, but I did address the family. And that was just an important part of my revealing and letting go of my secrecy. And then I have another experience, a couple of summers with two cousins that are siblings. And that's been a later journey in my 30s, I guess, probably, where I continue doing the family, gatherings, and feeling like out of obligation, I was still not wanting to cause
Mm.
havoc or difference by actually not willing to hug them or address the secrecy of an incident with each of them that had happened. So in my 30s, I actually decided that was no longer a secret I was willing to hold. And once again, allowed my anger to be written in letters to both of them, which really what I stated was, I'm no longer holding this secret. It's now yours. I know what happened. I'm not carrying it any longer. I am unburdening the secret
Mhm.
from my own system. And now you're included in that secret because I know you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Mm.
And right in that felt very courageous, and
Mhm.
the driving courage I came to had an edge of anger, partly for me going along with it for so many years and not saying something, but also for them having perhaps never addressed it or confided or shared their own apologies, right? And they knew what had happened in my own family system, in my closer family system. So part of me really wondered if they were just waiting for me to have addressed and, spoken to them about what had happened. So
Probably hoping that you never would, right?
perhaps not remember, right? Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
So what I'm really curious about is, can you imagine with these 4 different scenarios,
Mhm,
anything that an adult could have done to have prevented the harm from happening?
mhm. Yes. And I think there is no guarantee.
Yep.
However, I want to believe that when families aren't in any sense of denial about what could happen, I think there is more genuine curiosity in a family when a child says, I don't really want to do that anymore. Or is there another way for me to go somewhere without having to go in this manner? Like I didn't want to really go in the car anymore. Or had my mom had some curiosity about what keeps you from wanting to do that, LaDonna? Or is there anything you're concerned about? Or is there anything that's ever happened to you that you would want me to know? I'm here as support to you and a protector of you and your safety. Had I been living in an environment that carried some of those open-hearted, genuinely listening, curious places, I would like to believe I would have lived and shared it differently at a different time in my life, perhaps much earlier on. But I think most of my family system lived in the denial that it had happened.
Mhm.
And so I came in much later in my family's life as a oops kind of child. And I think everybody still wished and hoped nothing would happen. And it's not that people didn't know something had happened. I believe some of them actually knew something had happened. But my mother, in her own means of protecting her own self and system, which makes a lot of sense, and just really minimized
Mhm.
what she had been told earlier in her own life, right? By my other sibling, who was again much older than me. So had my mom stayed curious, I also believe had my mom worked through what I imagine may be her own abuse,
Mm.
I've always wondered, I don't think I'm the first generation. So I have strong hunches about that. And had she addressed her own courage and facing her own shame and her own denial, her own pain.
Mhm.
And I don't say denial with judgment. I get our protective systems push things down and bury them because we don't want to get anywhere close to that pain or shame.
Mhm.
So I don't say that in a way. I know it's a protective nature and a protective part of us. And yeah, for her own health and her own well-being, if there was time for her own in her own life to have spoken up for herself, right? And not having to have oppressed her own system, I think she very well could have been more curious about my system, right?
Mhm.
So that hence really has inspired me and led my activism. And this isn't the only thing I'm passionate about, but it's one thing I've been passionate about in my, especially my earlier life. As I became a parent, I was like on fire. I so felt strong driver to protect, to care for, to be the mama bear that was going to try everything possible from allowing or enabling or supporting in some way harm to my own child. So yeah, I think that that certainly fired me up. And
Mhm.
I chose to take that energy and that spirit into activism, right? Which really was an important part of my life, my healing, part of my storytelling.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so you're in your family, there wasn't any kind of open communication or education about this is something that happens in life and you can come and talk to me. No, it was
No,
no.
no. My parents were born in the 20s of a different generation. And that's not to say people currently living, and born in the 50s and 60s still don't know how to have sometimes those conversations, right? So
Yeah.
I don't I don't just say it's generational. I think it could very well be generational of the family system I've come from, where confrontation or silence is how we manage conflict
Mhm.
rather than speaking our voice and speaking up for ourselves. My father was fairly verbal, and what I never saw was if there were differences in my family system, we could actually debate or discuss. It was often a shutdown
Mhm.
and a silence. So when there were differences, it would like you're going to go into your own corners of the house. And it was like silence that was really painful to witness and to live because there's so much to explore and share. But the verbalizing of that conflict or things that were difficult was never really modeled, right? Or invited, honestly.
Yeah. Mhm.
I had parents that had very different views around race. And in both experiences of my parents, for as young as I believe I was like 11 in junior high, I had this awakening that they were racist. And I remember, knowing this because my mom wanted to know why I was hanging out with my friends who were different, right? And she made a derogatory reference to that. And so, what do you mean? Little did she know, like one of them was my first boyfriend. And I thought, oh my goodness, I can't even tell my mom about something like who I choose to be, who I'm attracted to, let alone the secrets I was already bearing, right? So there were messages of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And I would have loved for her to have said something even just around my friendships. What are they like? Like, what do you like about them? I mean, like there was no curiosity. It was just a shutdown. So that shutdown, I think, was often unspoken, but experienced, right?
Yeah.
So my system knew, like, we're just not going to say, I don't think there's an audience to listen.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, my system
modeled.
learned.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Can you give me a taste of how it was raising your daughter? What conversations were like, how you were curious, how you were able to protect her?
Oh, absolutely. So when she was coming into the world in my belly, I was in group. I had been in group. I had been in therapy for like 4 years, and I'd been doing a lot of hard work around my sexuality, around wanting to be sexual. And that having really been so entangled in my system about the joy of intimacy and sex. And in my way, I was more of a caretaker of the intimacy rather than a receiver. And I wanted to be, but that was very confusing to my system. So in much of that young relationship, I did a lot of healing with my daughter's father around actually getting to have needs and wants and expressing them. And when she was born, I then also started my activism because I realized with this young toddler how powerless I felt. And so I was always so open with her about her body and her own sense of curiosity around her body. I was also raising my stepdaughter at a very young age. I was in my 20s when I started raising and caring for her. And I felt very protective of her having a voice, speaking up, not being hurt by others' words, but really helping her and modeling for her what it was like to advocate and stand up when something felt hurtful. So I found the older she got, as well as bringing my own child into the world, my speaking up became even more vital and important in communicating and modeling. So that kind of propelled my voice even further, right? I was like, okay, now I have a little being listening and watching and kind of mirroring everything I'm going to model here. How do I carry a voice rather than swallowing and not having one? So for both of them, there would be moments I'd go to my parents' house, for example. This was probably the easiest example to give. And my dad, he would, he was an older dude. He was, sometimes he didn't shave after he retired. He'd give these sloppy kisses and it was like, ew, like, he was my dad. So whatever, like he was never inappropriate with me per se. So but when it came to my children and my stepdaughter and my daughter, they didn't always, especially my little one. I don't remember my stepdaughter as much saying this and feeling this kind of feeling, but my daughter was like, I don't want to kiss grandpa. And I'd say, okay, then you don't need to kiss. You don't need to hug anybody you don't want to kiss or hug. Even me, you have permission to tell me if something you don't want to hug right now, and mom wants to call you and you don't want that, you get to say, Mom, not right now. So I welcomed her setting limits in her own body. And that also required, some education to my own mother in that journey, because my mother said, oh, just give your grandpa a kiss. And I'd say, Mom, I know that feels like the norm in your generation and your teachings and probably how you raised me, but I'm choosing to do this differently. I want her to listen to her system, find words, and speak up when she needs to. And then my job, and I'll invite others, is to listen, which I get is really hard.
Yeah.
This is what I need of you. No pressure. No pressure. You don't get to pressure her.
Fantastic.
So, and I modeled that right in front of my daughter.
Awesome. Awesome. So
With love, with
yeah.
love, with assertion,
Yes.
and I also would say things like, Dad, and I'm sure you're going to be okay with this. You're a big boy. Like, you can handle your granddaughter not wanting to give you a kiss.
Yeah.
Kind of as my way of like, you're the adult here, take care of your own feelings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those do not need to be burdened onto my own child, right? I got enough of them. I don't want to burden her with more. I'm sure I'll burden her with some of my own, but I don't need anyone else's to contribute to that, right? So let's keep it as clean as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was an important part of my parental journey. And being open about intimacy and sex as she aged, both of them. I remember my stepdaughter really wanting to share her sexual encounters in life and her readiness or not readiness. And we had an open relationship. And at times in her life, that was a little hard to listen to, but I was so grateful she was willing to tell me what it was like to engage in her sexuality. And with my own daughter, it wasn't always as easy for her. It's still not as easy for her to openly want to share. And though I always imagine there's another part of her that would love to be able to. And who knows, that relationship is continuing to mature. Of course, she's clearly an adult now, and that's there's still some untangling from being my child, also an adult woman, and me being mom. And so we're still doing sometimes our adult dance. Yeah. And I don't need her to. That's the other piece, that like my own mom needing me to do certain things, I don't need her to be open with me. I trust when she wants to be, or there is no one else she has to confide in, that she will. And I would hope she always knows I welcome all of those places she may decide she wants to share someday, even probably the worry she may have felt is that I never wanted something to happen. And even if it did, I always wondered if she would protect me by not sharing it with me, in fear that I would feel so responsible, right? And yet the reality is I had to let go, right? When I divorced her dad, I had no idea who was carrying or protecting her when I wasn't there. So talk about like big spiritual teachings and work, was this continuous process of letting go of my fears and trusting, right? When I didn't know if I could trust, but I wanted to believe I could. And so that fear required a lot of my attention. Otherwise, I would just feel so in such terror that I wasn't there to protect her. And I could feel that terror energy, right? I remember it so well. Like, okay, you're 5 and I'll see you after the end of the weekend.
5. Okay.
He was 3.
She was
And I'd
3.
be like, oh, like I felt like I put all this effort and I totally trusted her dad, but I didn't always know who she would be around. So it wasn't about not protecting my ex-husband as much as it was about the trust we have of people in our communities, but still we don't assume. Sometimes people don't have the safe experience, even with people we love and believe we should trust. So I didn't get to be there to screen or check out or do much of that for some of those early times in her life, right?
Mhm.
And so I found my advocacy an important part of working through a lot of that energy. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to tell my story, it will help others to tell theirs. And perhaps with that, we could also continue and help break some bit of the cycle of silence, right? Which I think we were on that same journey together back in the early 90s, right?
Mhm.
Little
Yeah,
did we didn't know each other then,
I
but
know.
we were on that same journey.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is a good jumping off point to share a little bit about that with us
Mhm.
for you.
Yeah. So you want to hear how I got started into that world?
Yeah, yeah. How did that happen?
So it started with, first of all, my very first therapist, 20, and thought someday I was so impacted by what I sensed was her courage, but what she was really showing me was her courage, having also been a survivor, inviting my courage and to invite me to experience courage in the room by
Hmm.
finding my voice, by telling my story, by allowing anger, allowing all spectrums of feelings and experiences, and unburdening, right? And allowing light to shine on all the places I was holding pain and experience, sense of trap and stuck, right? All the processes that I currently work with. So the idea of being a therapist was planted. And then a couple years later, still, of course, not really on that path quite yet, I met a woman at a store signing petitions. What at the time was AB 2500. And that was some legislature. I was in my early 20s, I was probably like 26 or something. And I had my daughter with me shopping at the store. And she's like, do you want to sign this petition? And I said, well, what's the petition? Long story short, it ended up being Megan's Law. So I worked my butt off getting signatures to bring this to the assembly at the state in Sacramento. And what ended up happening was will my friend, who I ended up becoming friends with, and I come and speak at the assembly. And so at the time, we were kind of in this adventure about how do we want to create it a nonprofit. Like there's movement here, there's work to do. And her son was um, a victim of abuse by a trusted neighbor who had like high security clearance at Lawrence Livermore Lab. Like there was a persona, right, that you would assume should be trustworthy, and yet he wasn't.
Mhm.
So she came as a mom and I came as a survivor together. And we went to the state assembly, and it was my first attempt at telling my story to people I didn't know, because I'd already told my family. And all I really did at the time was cry. I really couldn't put words to the story yet, but it impacted, right? So with Polly Class's father, Mark, and my friend, and probably a few other people, we attempted to tell stories. And really, again, I shared my heartfelt terror of having a 2-year-old child and wondering when she was going to play sports, or wondering when she was older, if I wanted to know if someone was a registered sex offender, how how could I get the knowledge of that so that I knew coaches weren't offenders, or so that I knew we were doing something protective, not to say I wanted them driven out of our neighborhoods. I
Mhm.
just didn't want to put them or have my child in a position where they had access to her.
Mhm. That's
And
right.
that was not information at the time being revealed. So
Mhm.
that kind of launched, right, a whole campaign. We wrote a curriculum for the schools. We spoke out in neighborhoods or communities where kindergarten teacher was revealed. We would be asked to come and speak, etc. So we were doing a lot of that activism. And even back then, I wanted those being accused to get help and care,
Mhm.
because I felt back then I never wanted to drive. There was such an angry drive for so many people that wanted to, like lock them up, put them, but if they've served time, I wanted them to find a way for healing, to come back into the world with care, but also with protection for those around us, knowing the recidivism rate is often high because they're not getting the help they needed, right?
Mhm.
And so that was just kind of an interesting slant when I look back, even on my young adult life, that I didn't want them to be killed. I didn't want them to be dead. I wanted them to get care.
Yeah.
And so that led to some talks. I was asked some years later, a few years later, to do an MTV special that was called Fight Back. It was part of their anti-violence campaign. And there were 6 of us telling a bit of our stories. And the Fight Back motto was, how do we come back, telling our stories and taking our own sense of power back?
Mm.
And for me, the metaphor in that documentary was, much of my experiences were in a car as a passenger, as a little girl, whereas I got to take the driver's seat and drive the car away, right? The metaphor of that was really powerful.
Mm.
And some years later, got asked to be on an Oprah show. And the children were on the panel, and you asked the very same question Oprah asked me, is LaDonna, what the whole story and that whole document or that whole series that she was offering, she did so many shows about this, is would you know if your child was being abused? And her question of that show was to the children, how do we know? How do we cultivate an environment where you can tell us? And my only part in that story was telling what it was like to be 8. So I didn't really get to advocate in the way I really wanted to tell my own story. But I did get to be a part of that show, right? Which was actually painful in many ways, because you really didn't get to see where I truly was in my healing. All you got to see is this short clip of being 8 or 10.
And what would you have liked to said if we were on the Oprah show right now? What would
Much of what I'm saying now is
uh-huh.
that I could also share with you my 8-year-old experience of feeling trapped in the car, but I could also share my beliefs today of advocacy, of healing, of care for my system, being compassionate for my own system, being compassionate for others that have been harmed, and bringing compassion and curiosity to those offenders that or humans that have perpetrator parts that too also need care.
Mhm.
And that didn't get to be spoken, right?
Mhm.
So that is a pivotal part of my current life message, right? Is how do we do that? So since that, I've shared my story with large audiences, and some some filmed, not filmed, and certainly have worked in my own community, in the therapist community, around running groups for individuals. I've worked with men and women having experienced sexual abuse. I have also worked with some individuals that have perpetrated others or have perpetrator parts. And that's been a really important part of also my ability to hold. And my little girl doesn't have to feel so terrified. She knows I will care for her and won't allow harm as best as I can today in my life. That she knows there's advocacy for her, and that I would do all that I could in my abilities to protect and care for her. So that's been an important part of my advocacy, my journey, and in being an advocate in the community.
So can you go a little bit into the internal family systems for those who don't know? Because I hear you talk about this part and that part, and perpetrators have people who have harmed. Yeah.
Sure. So it's a modality. I studied process therapy for many years with the Hadlocks, And I've studied with the internal systems family model, because there is this experience we have, I believe, and what the model supports is that we have our own internal family system. And oftentimes when we're suffering, and I think of sexual abuse, for example, that young part of me, and I think the easiest way for me to explain it is to share a little part of my own system, right? There was a young part of me that carried the experience itself, right? I would call her an exiled part. She often got pushed out because shame was such an experience she carried. And a part of my leader that I shared with you in the very beginning that got praised for having leadership skills got so busy being a leader. It was a wonderful way of avoiding the shame and the part that carried all the sorrow and the pain and the trauma, right? So in my own system, when I get super busy in my life or in my own career over the years, it's a recent part I've been looking at is it okay? And COVID really forced this for so many of us. Is it okay to slow down? And what happens when we do? Because what I know is often when we do, parts of us get really uncomfortable, right? And so for me in COVID, parts of me that were grieving got really uncomfortable. And I could hear another part of me, but like, no, we don't want to go there. It's the same example that I had as a younger person with the part that was carrying a lot of the trauma. And another part that's like, but you get praised, be a leader, go do this. You get seen, you get heard, you have skills, you get reinforced how successful you are. My careers did that for me. I kept getting promoted. I kept making more money. It was great. And in some ways, my system was not wanting, because it's all they knew how to do was create a busy to keep me avoiding from the sorrow and the pain and the shame it didn't want to feel, until I went in and did some of my own work with that young child that carried all of the struggle. So there's parts of us that protect, right? And it's not that any of them are bad.
Yeah.
They are all so vital to our sense of survival. And so I wanted to get to know that overachieving perfection leader that I had become at different times in my adulthood, still trying to prove I'm okay, trying to prove I'm a good person, trying to prove I'm lovable, right? I mean, all the compensations for some of the beliefs of the young one that carried beliefs she was bad, she had done something wrong. And then there was an active teenager in my early life that was like, new sexual encounters in hopes that she would get something. So I had a teenager that was quite promiscuous as a teenager in service in hopes she would get something back. And she was so hungry for attention and love and reassurance she was okay. And do you see me? And so she would serve, but she also felt tremendous sorrow and pain and more shame in that never getting back really what she deserved or wanted, right? But it was her best attempt, right, at coping and at getting what perhaps at that time she believed she could, in hopes of getting something that really was impossible to get from the relationship she was attempting to get it in. Yeah. So there's many parts of me. And in the internal family systems, we say there are no bad parts. Richard Schwartz really describes his story in his early 1980s, where he was working with someone with eating disorder, and he wanted to get rid of that part that kept forcing harm on the system. And it ended up really backfiring in his therapeutic work with her. And it was so traumatizing to witness as the therapist how powerless he was when he kept butting up against the part that actually would hurt the client. So client came in with a slash. I'm paraphrasing the story, of course.
Yeah.
And Dick said, wait a minute. I don't know what to do with you, but I keep trying to want to like almost like control you, that part of you that wants you to stop hurting her. And yet I haven't really been able to listen to you and what you're trying to do
Mm,
and protect. And
mm,
what, and you're right. The more I try to bump up against you, the bigger this part would get, protecting the system, right?
mm.
So we befriend, we get curious, we want to know all of these parts of us, and not any of them really are bad. They're often, though, in bad roles.
Mhm. Mhm. I'm loving hearing you, because I'm in my brain, I see the absolute similarity with nonviolent communication.
Sure. Oh,
All
absolutely.
of the tragic expressions of our unmet needs. We want to pay attention to those. What are those longings? What are those needs?
Absolutely.
What are those values?
Yeah.
There's
And
just
if we don't do that inner work, we're just going to demand or hope that other people know what we need, or we're going to request or demand it, and they're going to probably be quite resistant to that. And in the model of IFS, if we're in self-leadership, we can be with the parts of us that do have needs and request and make requests, but also the parts know ultimately we'll help with those needs and stay in relationship with others by giving voice often to what we're hoping for in relationship with each other, right? So when a partner is saying something they need, I want to lean in and be curious about that. But if I don't know my internal system well enough, I will likely get quite triggered hearing that, right? So
Mhm.
if I'm actually tending to my own internal system, I can be with others in a self-leader way with a form of nonviolent communication, right? Self-leadership
Empathy.
does
I'm
have
hearing
a very
empathy.
nonviolent means
Yeah.
of communicating, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So in my own experience, recently looking at some interesting shame that's coming up around being a teenager. And I could hear another part's like, no, we are not going back there.
Mm.
And when she kind of fires up, protecting me from some shame she knows resides in that teenage life, if I can't hold, so even just letting her have that big no brings this tingly sensation to my body. I could feel it's like all of it, all that adrenaline goes to my head and it starts to make my head tingle, right? So I'm just naming that because I want her to know I'm with her right now.
Yeah. Mhm.
And we're not going to go into my shame and reveal more than she wants, right? So when I can name her and talk about the experience, I know why she's here. She feels so understood and cared for by me
Mhm.
that she's been giving me permission by stepping back just enough. She wants to listen, she wants to watch, but she's giving me just enough space so I could actually spend time with my teenager, helping her unburden the shame she still carries,
Mhm.
how it's impacting my body still to this day.
Mhm. Mhm.
She's ready for help. They're actually, the part that wants to protect actually really knows and trusts me that I will help this teenager. And so she's giving me a lot more space right now.
Mm.
I don't know if that makes sense to your system, but what I want to disclose is
Mhm.
everybody's system is unique.
Mhm.
Though we have protectors, we have, different kinds of protectors, and we have different kinds of hurt, parts that carry hurt, we call them exiles. Everybody's story and the way our system works is a very internalized experience.
Mhm.
So the therapist doesn't pathologize any of that. It's a very non-pathologizing perspective. What we do come in with is a leaning in with a genuine curiosity of helping the system be seen, witnessed, understood, and helping the individual become in self-leadership to really be able to witness these parts that have been working so hard trying to protect.
Mhm.
And once they begin to trust that they're willing to step back so we could help heal these experiences we've had throughout our lives, right? So that our protectors don't have to stand in the forefront, right? With angry language or with the sense of protection of not letting intimacy get too close to us or hurting others, right? So there's many places to explore in the internal family system. So I'm not sure if that gave you what
Oh,
you're
yeah, that's very clear. Yeah. And I just love when I hear you say self-responsibility, I'm hearing self-empathy, there's 1,000 ways to roam, and they're just different words for, yeah, it's just beautiful.
Yeah, we call it when we're in self-leadership, we have the 8 C's. It's like experiencing at least even just one of the 8 C's, and that may be care. It may be compassion, it may be curiosity, right? We have the 8 C's. It's just kind of a way of also helping teach the model, right? Is like, because there's other words that don't start with the letter C, of course, right? But when we can have that internally towards our own system, right, that breeds kind of an ability and the groundwork for our system to begin to trust, right, that there may be other choices they've never realized. There may be other jobs. Maybe they don't have to work so hard. Never about getting rid of anybody. Right? They're all of value to the internal system. That they've just been doing a really difficult job sometimes in a bad role. Even when I think of, offenders or people with perpetrator parts, like in their highest self, which I believe we all have, they genuinely don't want to hurt others. They really don't.
It's they just don't know any other way to get their needs met, whatever those needs are that they're attempting to get.
And I'm not sure they really get their needs met, but for parts with perpetrator energy, it's sometimes the closest attempt to perhaps completion of maybe some of their own trauma, or they're living their own trauma. They're even, I think of Michael Jackson and his documentary, and all I kept hearing in that documentary was, he's like 12, reliving a part of his sexuality he never got to live. Of course, he was acting out as if he was 12, trying to have innocence and freedom and playfulness as a 12-year-old with other kids that age. But unfortunately, he wasn't fucking 12, right? So if we could be curious about that acting out part, which is what I believe the only way to help this cycle of abuse is, they too need the invitation to get close to the parts of them that act out. And we don't do that very well in our culture, in our society. Not any, but many. Our system certainly doesn't include that kind of invitation for those that are hurting and hurting others.
And if we were better in our culture, normalizing sexuality, right? And perhaps if it would have had a healthy outlet at the time of 12, right? That's just.
And he's an extreme. I mean, that's an extreme situation, being with such a young, superstar, that he was really deprived his innocent childhood, right? I could just see so much sorrow and pain in his journey, right? He's, I don't know that's certainly his story. There are many stories to be told. Listen and are able to hear their stories too. Which I know that's not the focus of your group.
Oh, no, great voices. Yeah, it's hearing people who were harmed and go on to harm others. And a brave voice is anyone who speaks up in so many different realms. That absolutely.
Reminding me that they too are included, right?
Absolutely. I would love to hear. anyone's coming with the curiosity and the no blame. I'm not here to judge. Brave Voices are not here to judge. We're to break the cycle of silence. And I think someone who went on to harm another will be the bravest voice of all if they're willing to come forward and share. Because we want to know what needs were not met for them to act out in that way.
And how their systems were burdened through their probably trauma, which is, I don't know that there's ever been a story without tremendous amounts of trauma for these individuals, right?
Yeah.
And at times they too were doing their best and in really bad roles, right?
Yeah.
Not bad parts, but bad roles.
Yeah.
So,
And when I use the word needs, these are the universal needs that every person on earth for safety and security and to be seen and to be heard and
cared for, right?
And to matter.
Absolutely. Absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was a great start. There's so many other avenues to go down, but for today, I'm going to thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. We'll just call this like part 1.
Exactly, right?
Perhaps it'll be a series someday, and I would love to do that with you. So,
all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well. Big love.
Thank you.